Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. We're just letting everyone to connect right now, but feel free to write in the chat where you're joining us from. Just letting the last people connect. So if you want to write in the chat where you're joining from, and Niamh, you can get started now.
Okay, thanks very much, Jess. Welcome everybody to today's webinar, which will look at the nexus between European arms trade and forced displacement and migration. My name is Niamh Bhriain from the Transnational Institute. I'm joining you today from Amsterdam. Maybe for those of you who haven't heard of Transnational Institute or TNI, just to mention that the Transnational Institute is a critical thinking research institute based in the Netherlands, as I said, based in Amsterdam. And for over the last almost 50 years, we've been acting as a nexus between progressive thinking, scholars, activists and movements, producing research, publications, analysis, knowledge. And this research is connected to key political moments and issues of our time. One of the themes that we've been working on has been war and pacification. We also have other issues in TNI that we look at, including public alternatives. We have a program on drug policy and various other areas. And today we'll be looking specifically at our work on borders, migration and the arms trade. If you are interested in hearing more about our work, I think there's a link on your screen where you can subscribe to our newsletter. And if you would like to support this work, there's a link, I think, also on our screen for donations, and you can also find that link through our website. So many thanks again to everyone who's joining today. I can see that we've got quite a few people online, and thanks also to our panelists. So maybe to kick off the discussion, so at the end of June, TNI published a report titled Smoking Guns, How European Arms Exports Are Forcing Millions from Their Homes. And we launched this to coincide with the 70th anniversary of the adoption of the UN Convention on Refugees, noting that at the same time there was a record number of people on the move, more so than ever before, and also there was more military spending as more than ever before. So we started to look at the correlation between the arms trade and forced displacement and migration. And today to discuss this nexus, I'm just delighted to be joined by excellent expert panelists. So I'm going to mention their names to introduce them. So we have MEP Hannah Neumann. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. We have Andrew Feinstein, Catherine Wollard, and Leone Hadavi. And I'm also delighted to be joined by Apostolis Fotiadis, who was a co-author of the report that I mentioned with myself. And I will introduce each of the panelists in more detail when I invite them to speak in the discussion. Just to mention for today's format, we will be introducing the report, first of all, that I mentioned. And then we will be asking Apo to weigh in because he was one of the co-authors with some key findings. And then I'll be asking each of our panelists to speak from their specific area of expertise. But also it would be great if you could post your comments and questions in the chat so that we can pick those up as we go through the discussion. And also to welcome today our listeners from Movement Radio. So for the first time ever, we have a radio station that is broadcasting live our discussion. So welcome to the listeners who are joining us through Movement Radio, which is based in Athens. Okay, I think that's all I need to say before I get into the content of today's discussion. So TNI, as part of its Border Wars work, which we've been doing since 2016, has largely looked at border policies along the lines of the political and corporate power structures that drive them, as well as those who profit from and benefit from them. And we've looked, geographically speaking, we've looked at the European border policies and also US policies, and not just their impact on the immediate borders, but also border externalization, including the externalization not just of borders themselves, but also we look at detention policies, for example, and their externalization. And so we've usually looked at the policies in terms of when people are already on the move. But with this report, Smoking Guns, we decided to go back to the very beginning and look at the moment when people are actually forcibly displaced and what provokes that journey of movement. And we looked at that focusing specifically on the European arms trade. As I said at the beginning, seeing that there's more military spending than ever before, and there's also more people on the move forcibly displaced from their homes than ever before. We chose 5 case studies to exemplify this trend that we were studying. So we focused on Syria, Iraq, the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then we also looked at Libya as a case study of where people who have already been forcibly displaced because of the use of European arms were then being stopped in that journey of movement towards seeking safety and protection, were then being stopped again by European arms and being forced back or being pushed back. The research methodology that we used included open source intelligence methods, and we're going to speak on our panel with Leone, sorry Leone for pronouncing your name wrong, Hadavi, who's an expert investigator in open source intelligence methods. So we'll speak to him in a little while. And basically what we did to a forensic degree was we placed European manufactured arms in a specific geographic location at a particular moment in time. And we were able to say with a high degree of certainty that the people who were displaced from those particular locations were displaced because of the use of European arms, be it that they were detonated, that they were discharged, or whatever arms that we were speaking about in the different case studies. I think that basically the conclusion that we were able to come to is that European arms and Europe as an extension of that, European countries, the European Union, are not just creating refugees through their policies, but they're also profiting from them through the arms deals that they're making. I think that this is one of the important points that we drew from the research. I'm going to ask, because I co-authored this report with Apo, so I'm going to ask that Apo draw out a bit more the key findings, and also I think the idea is to get into the discussion of the arms trade and migration in more depth with the other panelists as well. So Apo, I'll ask you to pick up from here with the key findings. So Jess, I think there's a slide for Apo to introduce him. Yeah, perfect, excellent. So there.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much, Niamh, for your introduction. A big thank you to all the panelists and the people attending the discussion today. Now, how all this started, it's about 2-3 years ago. We're in a panel where actually Catherine Wollard is also attending. We're trying to, come up with stronger arguments in favor of progressive border and refugee policy. And, the atmosphere in the room is very pessimistic because there's a feeling that no matter how good the arguments will be, the audience is not interested anymore. And I start thinking we have to get out of the box practically. If your arguments do not work, you have to try, to expand your understanding and try to convince people drawing from other fields of knowledge. And we have to go further back and understand, and convince EU audiences that a lot of what is happening at the borders and a lot that we discuss as a refugee issue is a product of other choices and decisions we also take in the European Union. And the strongest correlations seemed to be at the time to study better arms exports and go and discover the causal links between arms exports, displacement, who then feeds into migration and refugee flows. So it looked like a very good idea, and it seemed like it would answer a lot of things. But when we decided to do the research and get out of the box, we end up with very big questions and not convincing answers to them ourselves, which was good because we realized that research is actually crucial. But the first barrier there was actually the methodological issues and the lack of structure in approaching and translating across the two fields, arms exports and displacement. So during the research, we met barriers, we met problems when it comes to being able to study data that is extracted regarding displacement and being able to connect it back to arms exports. We realized that actually the experts that work on displacement don't very much contemplate how their subject correlates with arms exports. This actually led afterwards to an effort to understand why experts and policymakers in the two fields seem to be talking past each other, essentially. And it led to some kind of very specific questions. For example, when we asked some people in the COARM committee, the working group in the council that works on exports, whether they ever discuss with SCIFA, which is the committee in the council working on migration and border policy, discussing these issues, they don't really seem to interact very much, the two of them. Also, we never clarified whether LIBE ever interacts with SEDE, the subcommittee on security and defense in the parliament. Not so much, Hannah says. So it's interesting that structurally, these two worlds of researching, understanding, discussing, don't seem to meet very often. And this expands beyond the core institutions, per se. When I asked people at the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center whether they keep in mind exports, armed exports, when they actually work on extracting data on displacement, which they do very efficiently, actually, it didn't seem to be at the core of how they structure their research. And then I came up with the idea of asking the UN high-level panel on displacement, which was set by Secretary Gutierrez a year and a half ago, 2 years, whether exports is part of their mandate, and they are going to examine the correlations. And although I got an answer, a very formal answer, actually saying that although it's not in the, it's not out of the picture entirely, it's not really part of the mandate. And when this kind of high-level expertise seems to have missed how central the links ought to be between the two thematics, then it seems that there's a real gap. So the research actually is important, and that's the key finding among the key findings in the report. Now, the second very important area the research went into is what actually happens with the knowledge that is in place already. So even when we manage to do the case studies and find, that there is contribution into the problem from EU exports, how does this come back into the systems as feedback, and how licensing procedures and licensing authorities that take other decisions and do more risk assessments actually do incorporate what they already are able to find, or what can be contributed by the press, by activists, by open source investigators. And this also seemed to be very difficult to understand, because the world of licensing the exports is a dark world. It's very difficult to even find interlocutors there. No matter to raise issues about connecting consequences of exports to the actual decisions, and be able to discuss with these people how much displacement would probably be a factor in their decision-making procedures. So this was difficult. We approached a lot of people and a lot of authorities that are involved in decision-making procedures in different member states, and the response was really minimum. And the understanding we were able to reach was not very satisfying in order to have conclusions. But we realized that this is also a very important area that research can do more, and we can push further for better understanding and more transparency.
Mm-hmm.
The third key issue, and with this I will close my first intervention, is that how actually you frame what you want to talk about. Because when you tell to people that exports contribute to displacement, people understand that you talk about bullets and bombers and things that are very obvious. And they also accept the moral argument there that yes, we should be more careful with what we do when we export bullets and bombers. But through the research, it's very obvious that this is only a limited aspect of what we are talking about. Because when we want to touch on exports and how this might actually contribute to displacement, then we actually have to go into discussing transfer of technology contracts, how EU countries actually teach what they know to third countries about how constructing and creating the military capacity, which then they use in order to intervene in conflict zones. It's also about sales of components and parts, which are not so obvious, and their role is not understood very well. It has to do with service contracts that help the third countries maintain what they already bought and keep it active for very many years. So there's a lot of work to be done in actually explaining what the theme is. There's a lot of work to be done in expanding the evidence base we can produce, and this is where the role of open source investigative tools becomes very crucial. But I will leave it to Leone to explain more about this. I want to close with a key example of how important this is. During the last decade, Turkey managed to increase its military capacity massively and also acquire enormous know-how in production of military means. And this has happened a lot by contributions of through a transfer of technology and through contributions of components that have been licensed from EU countries. Germany has played a crucial role. UK has played an important role. France has contributed into this. Now, politically and geopolitically, Turkey played the role it has played during the last decade, and in many cases, it has been a destabilizing factor among many others regarding the situation we see in Syria, in Libya, in Nagorno-Karabakh. A lot of the military systems that have been used are able actually to be there and be deployed because of EU decisions made in the EU during the past decade. So it is important to understand that the decisions that are made are very long term and they have very long term consequences, and that's why we have to convince policymakers to increase oversight and transparency and actually let a discussion happen around these things.
Okay, thank you very much, Apo, for those initial comments. And for introducing some of the how the research came about, and also some of the difficulties in carrying it out and also accessing the information, and of course the concerns that we highlighted. I'm going to invite Hannah to join us now. So first of all, I will introduce her fully. So we have a slide, I think, Jess, that we've prepared, which I think you can see on your screen now. So Hannah Neumann, or Neumann, I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. So Hannah is an MEP, a member of the European Parliament. She is the Peace and Human Rights spokesperson of the Greens European Free Alliance, the Vice Chair of the Human Rights Committee, also known as the DROIT, a member of the Committee on Security and Defence Policy, and a substitute in the Committee on Foreign Affairs, as well as head of the Delegation for Relations with the Arabian Peninsula. And at the German Green Party, she is also a member of the Motions Committee. And I'd like to ask Hannah to speak a little bit to what Apo highlighted, and also taking into account, I suppose, that the arms trade is political. That was one of our conclusions in the report, I suppose. And the way that European arms are being exported, we exemplified a lot of the devastating consequences in our report. And we also saw that the existing regulation, like the Arms Trade Treaty and also the European Common Position, they have, in a way, they have legitimized or facilitated problematic arms trade. And yeah, I suppose we like to know a little bit more about the work that you're doing to look at this. So thank you, Hannah, for joining us.
Thank you for the introduction. And first of all, thank you for this amazing report. And this is exactly the kind of work that we need to have a political discussion about arms exports, because arms export is political. And it's mainly the industry that is trying to get it out of the political sphere and making it more of an administrative or economic thing to prevent this political discussion. We have, as the European Party, tried to figure out in the different EU member states, how do people actually see arms exports to war regions? How do people see arms exports to governments? Or, well, I mean, sometimes they're not even governments, they are just monarchs who commit grave human rights abuses. And we have a big consistency across all EU member states of citizens that do not want to see these kinds of arms exports. Nevertheless, they continue to happen. And what Apostolis just described, these kinds of arms exports that also increase migratory flows, which means they force people to leave their homes. Let's say what it is. They force people to leave their homes, are closely linked to these kinds of abuses and these kinds of problematic exports. And I'm very happy that by making it political, we are bringing these discussions together. So what are people using these arms for? Who is profiting from these sales? And why are some wanting to keep it in the dark? And why is it us as the Greens? I know, well, other politicians as well. I know you as researchers, some journalists who want to bring this problematic exports into the light. For me as a politician, because you asked, so what am I working on? The first thing is I want to make sure that we as politicians, but also citizens, can have a proper and informed debate about arms exports. So it's not even about saying we should never ever export arms to anyone. It's just saying we need to have information on the kind of licensing and export happening, on the end user, because often arms are exported to one agency, like you had the example with Turkey. So there is a legitimate arms export going to Turkey, but then it's not Turkey who is the final end user, but it gets diverted to someone else, and then it ends up with ISIS, and it's used in Syria, for example, for the displacement of people. And that's not just one case. So we have very often this whole line of exports, and once the arms is exported, we lose control over it. So that's one thing. We need to have an informed debate about where do these arms actually end up and what are they used for, because it's not what is in the license agreement. I think we also need a proper debate about where do we export arms, and in the correct way. Few people know, for example, that a lot of countries are exporting arms to Saudi Arabia that are used in the war in Yemen by Saudi Arabia. Few people know that countries are exporting arms to Sisi, the Egyptian dictator, who uses them to suppress opposition. And I found this very fascinating, how the industry somehow manages, and some governments, to keep this kind of really dramatic, violating exports out of the discussion. So that is also part of our work. And that's also why I'm very happy for this research and to connect the dots. And you do that for the first time on the migration issue. So we have this connecting the dots thing on conflict and crisis regions. We have it to some degree in human rights violation also when it comes to cyber stuff. And that your report is the first one that does the connecting dots issue on the migration. And I think it adds an important piece to the puzzle. And it helps to work towards the transparency. What I find very fascinating with your work, but for example, EU Arms does something similar. When I go to the German government, the French government, and I say, so what do you do in end user control? Because they are supposed to do it. But they say, oh, you know, it's so complicated and we can only do a few ones. So we need to tell the recipient that we are going to come and check if they have enough tanks, or the tanks are still there. And then we go there and then the tanks are still there. There are so much more useful ways of doing end user control. Open source investigation clearly is one. And we need to make use of that. And that's again something. So there is this official licensing business, And then there is the civil society work that is actually knowing much more than apparently governments are at least willing to tell us that they know. And we need to link the two, and we need to kind of force the formal track to take into consideration proper research coming from civil society and think tanks like the one you do for the licensing decision making. The third aspect is this whole issue. You mentioned the AT&T, so the Arms Trade Treaty and the EU Common Position. They have very clear rules on arms exports. So for example, they say arms should not be exported into crisis regions. Arms should not be exported if there is a danger that they will they will be misused for human rights violations. Well, we all know these arms exports are still happening. So in addition to transparency and a proper debate, we need mechanisms to hold governments or companies accountable if they violate these rules that we have given ourselves. And that is the biggest loophole at the moment. So these laws are there. They are also, even in the terminology, saying they are legally enforceable, but there is just no court we can take someone to if we think they are violating these laws. And this is why now that we are more and more discussing European defense, we are more and more discussing cooperation of EU member states when it comes to the production of defense goods, but also when we are discussing in the European Union Defense Union as a political entity, we need to make sure that with the same strength, speed, and sincerity, we also discuss the regulation and the control of these arms exports, of the arms that are coming out of this cooperation, and that we make sure, and that is why we will propose to transfer the common position into an EU regulation. There is also a legal way to enforce these political statements that all member states have made. So it's not us coming up with something, it's their own rules. We just say, okay, that's your rules. Now we need to ensure that we can hold you accountable, that you live up to these rules. And also that, for example, one member state that doesn't export can hold another one accountable that does export. Mm-hmm. Because that's where we are now. We have some member states saying, for example, we are not going to export to Saudi Arabia stuff that they can use in Yemen. And then another member state comes and does all these beautiful exports because they earn a shitload of money with it. This can't happen if you are a European Union with a common foreign security and defense policy. And I think that's where we have to go. One quick remark on the report and something that Apo said. Yes, it's good that you can track that European Union arms were used in kind of escalations that forced people to leave. I think no European Union company should earn any money with these kinds of work, but it's not the European company and not the European citizen that is shooting these weapons. These are still some shady terrorists, dictators, or whatsoever. We should not leave them out of the responsibility. So we have a responsibility, but they have one as well. And I just want to make this also very clear at this point.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Hannah, for that intervention. Hopefully, Hannah has to leave us at 5 o'clock, but I think hopefully we will be able to come back to you again before we finish. I'm now going to invite Andrew to join us. So we have a slide also presenting Andrew. Jess, if you can put it on the screen. So Andrew Feinstein is the Executive Director of Shadow World Investigations, based in London, and the author of, amongst other books, The Shadow World: Inside the Global Arms Trade, which was made into an award-winning feature documentary. He is a former ANC member of the Parliament in South Africa, where he served under Nelson Mandela. So Andrew, as an arms trade expert and author, I suppose one of the issues that we came up against in our research is that all of the case studies that we looked at they all involved arms that had been exported within the regulations. So all of the regulations had been followed, everything had been reported on, all of the, user agreement, the end user agreements, all of, everything, all of the ticks and boxes had been ticked in terms of what was required of the arms companies and the licensing, but we still see a situation where European arms are being exported to countries and ending up in, for example, Syria, ending up in Iraq in the hands of ISIS fighters, and ending up in the Democratic Republic of Congo, which, as we know, is a conflict-affected area for decades. So surely we shouldn't be looking then at regulating better or stricter the arms trade, but actually curtailing the arms trade in some shape or form because of the massive profits being made. So it's usually profitable to export arms. So surely the question around better enforcement of legislation or of regulations, I mean, is not the answer. What do you think as an arms trade expert? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Niamh. And thank you so much both for the invitation to be on this superb panel with so many great speakers, and for the report, which, as Hannah said, I think is a really important contribution to joining some of the dots that perhaps hasn't happened. In order to answer your question, and it also comes back to what Hannah was saying about the regulations, about the common position, the arms trade treaty, let's try and answer the question, well, who benefits from the status quo? And to do that, let's take a moment to examine some other features of the arms trade. So we know about the death, the destruction, the appalling immiseration that is caused, and a lot of which is documented in your report. There are other dimensions to it as well that aren't as obviously damaging, but have the effect of corroding democracies, of undermining the rule of law, and of course, of fundamentally negatively affecting people's lives. The arms trade is the most corrupt of all trades. It accounts for around 40% of all corruption in all world trade. That's an astonishing figure for a trade that averages around $400 billion a year. Large-scale arms deals are, in my opinion, a process of collusion between corporate executives of defense companies, politicians, and crucially, their political parties, who are often the beneficiaries of bribes from these arms companies and also of legal campaign contributions from these companies, military and intelligence leaders, and a whole variety of intermediaries, not just the sort of insalubrious arms dealers or agents or brokers we see in Hollywood films, but bankers, lawyers, auditors, etc., etc. And it's always the biggest in the world that dominate playing this intermediation role in arms deals. And then, of course, as I said, the political parties. You know, in Germany, for instance, from at least the time of Helmut Kohl through Gerhard Schröder to Angela Merkel, if you examine the amount of money that their political parties receive from Germany's large and small arms companies, you perhaps understand why even in Germany, which is supposed to have almost the gold standard of arms trade regulations, they are something of a fiction. It is the most under-regulated trade there is, and people, including the senior politicians I've mentioned and their corporate executive friends, operate with virtual impunity. Now, Hannah touched on the issue of what is often described as blowback, to use the phrase coined by Chalmers Johnson. And in your report, there's this brilliant example of weapons from Bulgaria that are sold to Saudi Arabia and the United States that land up in the hands of IS in Iraq. This is unbelievably common in the arms trade. Think back to Afghanistan, to Al-Qaeda, to the Taliban, and where most of their weaponry came from. It was from the US and Western countries. And unfortunately, to maintain this sort of fiction of a regulated, controlled industry, it is absolutely crucial for those who benefit, what I refer to as the global national security elite, to continually engender fear and a sense of insecurity amongst their citizens, to keep defense budgets irrationally high and to keep the arms trade ticking over in the way that it does. Now, let us think for a moment of the business model that is inherent in the report that you have written. The arms trade and all of those beneficiaries I've mentioned fuel conflicts and make billions and billions of dollars doing so. Those conflicts, as you've shown, create huge displacement and dislocation of people. The other element is that similar companies, some of the identical companies who make the billions from the arms, are also earning fortunes, stopping many of those displaced people from fleeing their countries and entering our countries. So we have this extraordinary business model of conflict, displacement, repel. And we have people who are incredibly close to our most senior politicians benefiting from that business model. A fail-proof business model if you can stoke fear, conflict, and dehumanize the millions and millions of people being displaced. And that, for me, is the key, is to take that business model and expose every dimensions of it, but also reveal the appalling politics and economics that underpin it.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you very much for giving us the connection with not just the arms trade, but the massive profits that are being made from it, the link between that and also the political sphere. And for underscoring, I think the point that came through very much in the report, that regulation is not enough we need to go much further than attempting to regulate, because of the massive profits that are being made among many of the other issues that you raised. I'm going to ask Catherine to join us now. I think we also have a slide to introduce Catherine. So Catherine Wollard is the director of the European Council on Refugees and Exile since 2016. ECRE is a pan-European alliance of 103 NGOs in 40 European countries working to defend the rights of refugees and displaced people in Europe and Europe's external policies. And ECRE's work covers litigation, advocacy, and communications. So Catherine, I'm going to ask you now to discuss the question of, so we've already looked at European policies with regard to the arms trade and defence, and I suppose on the receiving end of that is those who are forcibly displaced from their homes, forced to migrate because of Europe's defence and militarisation policies. So maybe you can speak a little bit to that from your area of expertise. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll add to the compliments by saying, from our perspective, this report is extremely useful. And I think in particular the case studies, because here you trace how these arms supplied by Europe are then seen appear again in certain conflict zones or in the hands of repressive forces creating displacement. Let me give a few comments on possible actions that we would see that derive from this report based on the recommendations that you've made, but going beyond them as well, perhaps. And these, I think, are in 3 areas. So there are clearly action points and recommendations that are purely for those who are working on arms control. All the issues related to regulation, absence of regulation, massive corruption, and the questions of institutional capture. The second area of actions, I think, are those that specifically come to those of us working on forced displacement. And here I would say we need to be doing more political analysis of the reasons for displacement. And prioritizing the prevention of forced displacement in all of our advocacy. And sometimes that has been an area which has not been sufficiently prominent or present. And I think that's necessary because we have to present alternatives to the status quo, which is this incredibly inhumane and restrictive asylum and migration policy that I think we're all aware of. In combating that, part of our advocacy is defensive, and it has to be, but we also there is an onus on us and a responsibility to present positive alternatives. And there are allies out there as well, particularly in external affairs and foreign ministries, who come at this possibly from other issues, but they see the damaging impact of foreign policy being dominated by the attempt to prevent migration towards Europe. And so I think also the reason for looking into this political analysis of the reasons for displacement is also damage limitation. There's a large amount of money now going to migration. So 10% of the EU's own external funding in the Indici instrument is earmarked for migration. One element of that is root causes. If we're not responding and putting forward alternatives, such as analysing and attempting to prevent displacement, that money will all go into border control and prevention of movement. So even though we've had the battle to try not to have this 10% earmarking, we lost it. Now, there's so much money there to work on migration. The EU and individual European countries don't know how to spend it. So there is also a reason to get involved. And I would say there's been a reluctance in the sector working on refugee rights to get involved in some of the politics of this. And I think that's primarily because the big international players are humanitarian actors. And their focus is defense of the humanitarian principles and not getting involved in politics. At ECRE, we are trying to create a space where some of this political work on security issues and the underlying causes of displacement is tackled and is in advocacy. My final point in terms of actions that I would see deriving from the report is what I would call joint work that brings together these two sectors that Apo has so rightly described as quite separate. Firstly, I would just add a note where I disagree with the report in the conclusions and the recommendations that says incremental steps, or implies that incremental steps are futile. Often incremental steps are all that we have. And I don't think this is mutually exclusive to trying to fight for the big political changes. The two happen in parallel. So I think any joint work could avoid descending into that battle between, let's say, the revolutionary political change and the incremental gradual change. We need both. Areas for this joint work, the possible working group that's suggested. Building into risk analysis and conflict analysis, proper assessment of the causes of conflict that lie in Europe, and actually going against some of what happens in conflict analysis, which is focused on the local. We also need to delocalize so that we look at the role of external actors when it comes to conflict dynamics. And within the EU, and I speak being here in Brussels, I'm saying a lot about the EU, but this also applies in a number of European countries. There are a number of different tools for risk assessment, sometimes early response, early action tools where this could be built in. A second element, looking at and analysing institutional capture, and particularly the role of the newish DG Defence and Enterprise, which is in-house, internal, co-opted, internal lobbyists, let's say. And the third element, engaging in mainstream security debates. I think there has been a reluctance in the displacement and refugee rights sector to even discuss security. And there's this very facile dismissal of problematic policies as securitization. And I think this is wrong. Security is the reason, absence of security is a major reason for displacement. We have to engage on it. And that should be, of course, from the human security approach. It's the absence of human security that leads people to leave. Security policies need to be based on that perspective. But even from a traditional security approach, a lot of these attempts to integrate migration make bad security policy. And so we can't just be talking about bad development policy. We also have to look at the question of security. And then my final point, because I can hear that from our moderator, in terms of areas for joint action, the funding I've mentioned, the NDICI, but also the border management instrument. We, as ECRE, we've done a lot of work on AMIF, the Asylum Migration Fund. We've tried to look into border funding. There's a lot more that can be done there. And this is exactly where the dual use purveyors of dual use tech benefit at both ends. That's where they're getting their money for the border reinforcement, border profiteering, if we want to call it that. And then finally, I think framing this issue and engaging in the narrative on it, I don't think we should be reluctant to use the argument from political expediency, which is to say, these policies, arms trade creates displacement, and for that reason, policymakers who are not our natural allies, but who are concerned for whatever reason about displacement, even in some cases for bad reasons, need to pay more attention to what's happening in that policy area. Voilà, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Catherine, and sorry for my my humming noise to
no, it was subtly done. The message came across, so
thank you. I'm just looking at the time. I'm going to bring in Leone, and then I'll get back to you, Hannah, before you have to leave, because I know you have to leave at 5. So I'm going to introduce Leone Hadavi. Leone is a freelance open source analyst, investigator, and trainer with background in security studies and law. And he's been involved in as an investigator with an EU arms project with the Dutch investigative journalism group Lighthouse Reports. And he was involved in in this research report as our OSINT, as our open source expert investigator. And so the case studies are in a large part due to his expertise in joining the dots between the arms trade, the actual armament that was exported from Europe, and being able to place it in where it was eventually used. So we're going to ask Leone to speak a little bit about this type of this research methodology, because it seems to be growing as a research technique in really forensically showing how European arms are responsible for horrific human rights violations where they're eventually used. So welcome, Leone, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks a lot, Niamh, and thanks a lot, everyone. It's gonna be easier for me. I'll be the last one to talk with the long interventions, so I can reply to all previous interventions and get away with it. Also, a bit of a disclaimer. So my part of the work is very limited and very science focused and exclusively attached to facts. So all the theories and the policies, it's something that I will try not to comment on, although that is also part of my interests and my background. So I think the starting point would be that starting from this report, the areas that are affected by these dynamics we have looked at, specifically with forced migration, those are exactly the places where, in theory, we wouldn't want the weapons to end up in. Forced migration is one final result of different violent dynamics. They all play different roles, and weapons are a part of it. And so my job is easy in the sense that when I investigate weapons that should not be in a certain place, that's exactly where I start looking. And that very often, with countless examples, we only reported 5 in this report, but there are probably in the hundreds of examples where you see in practice this whole machine of ideas and system that is in place that fails regularly, spectacularly, from small things and small volumes to very large and complex stuff. So yeah, again, for me, it's easy to point. My job is to point at the failures, and that's what I bring forward. But I think The element that can be underlined, I think, is the quality versus the quantity. I think there are a lot of great instruments that are in place at the European level, which have to be integrated at the national level by law. Some of the laws on paper are super valid. Also, there are international obligations, some of them seriously binding, as we said before. I think from the qualitative perspective, lots of them are vague, and lots of them are basic. Apostolis was mentioning how in today's world, it's weird how we only include in such control lists the physical item that is being sold, but not everything that is behind that same sale. So that is skill, that is part, that is also training, that only that's a new phase, a new angle that is only coming out very recently. I think in the EU there has been some more debating recently about the necessity of including more robust, yeah, it was a perfect job. I mean, it was great to provide enough ammunition to make more evident to everybody that this must be treated in the same way. Or in some cases, we've seen, for example, in Myanmar, some surveillance technology that is supposed to be, that was delivered to the Ministry of Interior, wasn't even classified as a delicate item and didn't even make the list. So from my perspective, there is very much I can do at the upper level. So I think, and I'll quote something that I think Apo said before, there is a lot of work to be done and a lot to do to expand the knowledge. You mentioned briefly before, open source intelligence gives us and a lot of other people a way into a domain that it was more reserved to a certain sphere that were closer to the state or to these groups of interest. Sometimes they overlap. So that is great. It is great that it's being integrated a lot more into mainstream media. That is something that I think Andrew had discussed before, had mentioned before. And it's great that there is a lot of interest to learn about these skills at a research level, at a scholar, academics level, at a journalistic level, because this won't substitute the job that the authorities are supposed to do and they are called to do and should be, I mean, they are bound to do. But from the other end, a more robust, our pushback would be more information. So more proof of how things are going wrong, more proof on how things need to change to keep up with those objectives that are on paper. And yeah, I guess that's what we'll keep on doing.
Okay, thank you very much, Leone, for that. I think I'm just looking at the time and I can see there's about 6 minutes before Hannah has to leave us. And I think a number of us have mentioned aspects of the arms trade that are problematic and aspects of European arms deals and arms exports, defense policies that are very problematic. So I think, Hannah, before you leave, I think I'll invite you to maybe respond to some of the comments that were made. And I think there was also a question in the chat that came in that was specifically on the arms trade also and stricter export rules that even if we enforce stricter export rules, that's probably not necessarily enough to curtail the massively lucrative arms industry. So maybe you can respond to some of the comments and also take that into account. And thank you very much. I know you're against the clock, so thank you for your time.
It's all fine. And again, thank you for having me in this amazing cast of people. And I would pick it up from Leone, actually. when it comes to arms export, and because it's the kind of secretive business that Andrew mentioned, it's easy to look away. There are a lot of incentives to not look into who exports and where does it end up. And I see it as my job as a member of parliament and as someone to control the government in this kind of export decision makings to look deeper into it. And I really think the kind of work that you guys are doing is super instrumental for me. And is super instrumental for me to bring also this kind of work into the decision making and to really confront decision makers with the kind of research that you find. It's a bit cumbersome, and Leone just alluded to it somewhere, that many governments actually have this kind of knowledge. So we know, for example, that the French Secret Service, they know very well which arm is used exactly where for what purpose and does what kind of destruction. Only they use it to check if their arms are working properly and to improve their sales. So in a very different way. So it's good that we have this counterbalance from civil society, but we need to make sure that it finds formal ways into parliaments, into decision-making bodies, and we use it better to hold our governments accountable. I'm picking it up there from the question, so will it help if we just make the rules more strict? Or if we just enforce the stricter rules? I think it's a key first step, because the rules are not that bad. The problem is there are 100 ways they are undermined. And the key point is, and here again, I'm picking it up from Andrew a bit, but also from Catherine. At the moment, those making the licensing decisions are state bodies. In most EU member states, the state is either the same as the defense industry, or state and defense industry are closely linked. So those are making the decisions who benefit from a positive export decision. And this is what we need to uncouple. Arms trade is the most underregulated trade, but it's also the most deadly trade. And that in itself is really a perversion of how we should understand politics and responsible politics in the world. And the key step has to be to really enforce the rules we have, to uncouple those who profit from the decision from those who make the decision. So we need some kind of ethics body, as we have it in medical research or medicine, for example. Why don't we have that for arms trade? I don't get it. With experts on the subject matter who connect the dots, with experts providing them with information and not just the Secret Service withholding information from them. And then let's see where we are. So rather than writing up new rules, I wouldn't even know which better rules to put in place. Maybe we could add corruption or gender-based violence, but in general, they are quite good. So rather than writing new rules, let's make sure we really live up to the expectations in the old rules by decoupling the two spheres. And I think that's a perfect point that the report makes, and Catherine explained again the effects on the population, this vicious circle of money making with militarization. So you earn by selling the arms, and then you earn by making sure that the effects that were caused by you selling these arms do not come to Europe with the migrants. And I'm afraid they will find new and more creative ways to even continue this vicious circle. And that's exactly what we have to stop. And I'm very happy that at least in this sphere, we are discussing it. But we are like-minded, and we have to be very aware of that. So let's all work together to get this out to those who are not like-minded, but whom I really want to hold accountable for what they do.
Thank you very much, Hannah. I know you have to leave us now, but I really appreciate your input. And also maybe just to say that we have the report translated into German, and that we will be making it available to a German audience in the coming week or so once the design is finished. So thank you, Hannah, for joining us. We really appreciate your time. I am going to ask Andrew to come back in. I think so much of what we're discussing is we're not so much getting into the migration and forced displacement, but we're very much sticking, I think, to the arms trade. One of the phrases that Catherine used was about the institutional capture. And I think also Hannah alluded to this as well and in some of her comments. And I suppose, yeah, just looking at the massive profits that are being made Yeah, maybe Andrew, I can ask you to discuss a little bit the institutional capture and how, because one of the questions that we've asked is how can we push back against this, and there's obviously no easy answers. I also see a question in the chat that's about how can peace activists become more involved in the nexus between the arms trade and migration. So perhaps you can weigh in a little bit on that.
Sure, thank you very much. You'd think after almost 2 years of lockdown, I would have got used to unmuting by now. But just very quickly, a few things. I think that the starting point is, as Hannah said, there are all of these regulations. Is it about stricter regulations? No, it's about enforcing them. And that requires structural change. And I think Hannah has spoken importantly about this decoupling of the state and licenses. That's the first thing. I would say that the second thing is something that Hannah mentioned earlier on in her first input, which was the manufacture of weapons should not be a for-profit business. And this is part of the problem. I happen to believe that there are certain things in societies that should not be done for profit, and that one can create other types of incentives. And we've seen examples in pharmaceuticals, for instance, of other types of incentives working as effectively in terms of research and development as the profit motive. And I think that particularly when it comes to the manufacture of what are weapons of death, ultimately, we should have these similar standards. I think also, obviously, the broader notion of human security rather than national security and defense, where we understand security as our vulnerability to health pandemics, as we're living through at the moment. The climate crisis, which, some of the security fears that we are told we need to spend billions of dollars fighting are actually somewhat irrelevant if we don't address the massive climate crisis facing the planet. Inequality and racism, I would suggest, are two other issues that underpin a lot of what we're talking about. So I should also say that much to the disappointment of even some of the researchers I worked with on the book, The Shadow World, I'm actually not a pacifist. My mother was a Holocaust survivor who lost almost 40 members of her family in the death camps. And in that context, I would have probably taken up arms myself. I do actually believe that there is space for a very limited, highly regulated arms trade that actually makes us safer, rather than the current situation where there are many characteristics of the arms trade, like some of our allies who are the biggest buyers of arms from our countries, who are actually the biggest financiers, ideological supporters, and often weaponizers of some of the groups we're supposedly engaged in a perpetual war on terror against. So what is the key? How do we move from where we are to where we want to be? And I agree entirely with Catherine that it's a matter of working in parallel incrementally and at the bigger structural changes. Unfortunately, often if you're working on those bigger structural changes politically, you get excluded from a lot of the incremental work. So to be very critical of the companies and the governments means that they often don't want to consider your inputs. But this is why it's so important that civil society is as broad-based as it is, and that there are many of us working in many different ways on these same issues. But the key to all of this, whether you're working incrementally or at the macro structural level, is that it's about active citizens needing to be aware of what is often being done in their name and with their tax euros, pounds, or dollars. So I think the provision of information in ever more creative and innovative ways, such as your report is doing, and such as most of the people who are talking here today do, is the crucial first step. And using that information as widely and broadly as possible amongst ordinary citizens who can then confront and hold their politicians to account, because as we've established today, it is those very politicians who are benefiting from the current status quo. So we citizens have to enforce our political will on our representatives. And, you know, sometimes we think, oh my gosh, but these people are so powerful. When we look at the defense companies and the people who run them, when we look at our politicians and political parties who often seem to be enthralled to corporate interests more than the interests of the people they were actually elected to represent. And that can make us feel a little bit hopeless and a little bit demotivated. It should actually do the opposite. And perhaps I have this view, and what is sometimes described as a naive and idealistic view. I would like to describe it as an optimistic view, because I come from a country that through millions and millions of global citizens in the international anti-apartheid movement, and through the rising up of its own citizens in the townships and squatter settlements of South Africa, that we overcame 350 something years of racist oppression. So I have seen with my own eyes that it is possible. I have seen the impact that citizens globally and nationally can have. And I think that's how we as citizens need to confront these issues of what I would like to describe as hyper-militarization and the sort of business model that I was describing earlier.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for that. And it's always, yeah, it's always inspiring, I think, to hear an example of a place where people have come together and have pushed back against what seems to be, you know, incredibly powerful, but actually when the people come together and organize it and they push back, the power that people can actually have to bring about change so thank you for bringing us that example from South Africa. I think I'm going to bring back in Catherine again. I think just one thing, Catherine, when you said that the report says that incremental change is futile. I think that because I went back to look at it to see how we had actually written it. What we said was, if we don't speak about a political shift, if we don't really aim to bring about a political shift, that if we make incremental, like small changes, but don't really push back against those power structures, I think that's what we were getting at, that ultimately those small changes won't be enough to push back against the power of the defense industry and the arms trade. So I went back to check what had written in case we had it, but I think that's what we were getting at, that it would be both pushing for a political change, but part of that pushing involves the incremental steps. And I think just one of the things that you mentioned was about the reluctance of groups that are involved maybe in migration or in humanitarian assistance, kind of their reluctance to engage on a bit more of a political level. So maybe they're just at the incremental step level, and they're not maybe working within the larger political frame. And I suppose I'm just wondering, or asking myself, how can we bring all groups on board so that we can all kind of work together to push for more of this kind of, not just kind of small steps, but that we don't just see ourselves with working at a small step level, but that we're really pushing for, I suppose, the kind of political change that Andrew mentioned, you know, that we're really looking to push for something much bigger. So yeah, and thinking in terms of human security, how can we bring more groups on board?
Thank you. I'm going to answer that immediately, controversially, saying that we shouldn't even try. There are certain things that humanitarian organizations will not do, will never do, and in a way, rightly so, because their objective is the delivery of humanitarian assistance and preservation of the how should I say that, the chance, the possibility to operate in a particular context. But that to me, I think, lies in terms of an explanation as to why there has been a sort of separation between these issues. I think it doesn't preclude new alliances where there are certain organizations, other actors within the refugee rights, displacement, migration sector, who do work more actively on security and political matters. And I think this also responds to one of the questions in the chat, which with an organization that's working with people directly affected, migrants, refugees, asylum seekers themselves, who very often raise the issue of Europe's complicity in generating the displacement and the situation that led them to flee in the first place. So I think if we look at the whole of the landscape when it comes to organizations working on asylum and migration, there are a lot of potential allies and a lot of organizations that would be willing to engage on this question of, yes, the arms trade, which I sort of frame as one element of Europe generating conflict and displacement. Of course, it's our subject today and the topic of your report. A couple of final sort of related points. In terms of what are the areas where this cooperation and joint work can take place? I think it really is this area of looking at prevention of forcible displacement in the first place, and getting into a deeper analysis of the causes of displacement, because then immediately the research that you've done, future research using OSINT technology, all the rest of it, this is directly relevant to that debate. And then that's a sort of broad definition of an agenda. There's also the narrower piece, which is something along the lines of destruction of the business model that allows profiteering at both ends of the displacement path. The companies that have been described by Andrew, and also in your report, of course, that are on the one hand generating conflict and or repression. I think in talking about displacement, it's always useful to separate the displacement generated by repression and persecution, where it's perhaps easier to identify the role of the arms trade, and that generated by conflict, where it becomes a bit more diffuse. But either way, the companies at that end who are then now massively cashing in due to this obsession with preventing people from crossing borders to seek protection in Europe. A final comment, which also comes back to one of the questions, or some of the different questions in the chat. Of course, there are many of the, I think, because I've worked both on conflict prevention and on displacement, and you have two areas which are somehow quite depressing, where getting results is difficult. If you bring them together, does that make things, does that exacerbate the difficulty in getting results, or does it lead to more prospects? I think in a sense at this particular moment there are opportunities that arise on this. So some of these long-standing, decades-old questions of arms control and arms export, the arms control work advocate, that there is a certain new impetus due to this displacement question. So I think it does open up opportunities. And I would say there are, in terms of policymakers, power holders who can be influenced. There are, of course, the parties that have traditionally been sympathetic on this issue, allies and institutions. But I think there are also currently mainstream political parties and political actors and technocrats in institutions who are a bit more receptive than they might otherwise be to the harms of the arms trade. And that's partly because this issue of asylum and migration is generating such a level of political crisis in Europe. And there is an inability to respond in an effective way, be that from a protection perspective, which of course is our perspective, but for those who care less about the fundamental rights of people, it is also a major headache. They want to neutralize this issue. They're trying to do that by preventing the arrival of people regardless of the cost and consequences. That's not possible to do because it depends on other countries that are not within our control. I mean, it's not possible to stop people moving. So there is an interest also in preventing displacement there from certain, let's say, more mainstream political parties. And this, to some extent, can counter some of those corrupt networks, let's say, and the advantages they gain from arms companies and the others who are perpetuating some of this. That's not necessarily a good motivation, but it is something that if we address this from a point of political expediency, that we can take advantage of.
Thank you, Catherine, for that. And it's good to get your, when you say you've been working on conflict and migration, and that you still manage to see that there are opportunities, also linking in with what Andrew said about the positive example of the people power in South Africa. It's good to hear again that there is a positivity that we can take in the work that we're doing. I think I'm going to put a question now both to Apo and to Leone. One of the things that we've touched on is about the provision of information and how important it is that information is available, so that in these struggles that Andrew and Catherine have mentioned, that people are informed and that they can, that they can then, be involved in activism and pushing back and mobilizing, organizing. So I suppose, as a journalist and also as in Apo's case and in an open source investigator expert, in Leone's case, how important is it that we have reliable information, that we put reliable information out there, and that people who are receiving that information are then able to use it to push towards the change that we're trying to bring about? Maybe I'll go to Leone first, because I cut you off at the beginning to get Hannah, and then we'll finish with Apo.
No problem. Sorry, Apo. And it's hard to talk about change that can be brought about after Andrew's example from South Africa. That's a tough one to top. But I absolutely think that a great arena in which we can react to this dynamic. Information, if you think about it, should be one of the byproduct of this control and monitoring system that the states and international organizations have put in place already. So the starting point of an investigation into arms export from an open source investigation perspective would be either you find a weapon on the ground that you know is not supposed to be there, and then you trace back to the country of origin after you have identified it and geolocated and chronolocated, so you know where we are and when we are there, and see if from that country there has been any recent exports. Or you do the other way around and you see among the list of exporters of a European country if there is anyone that could be controversial or plain illegal as a user. The problem with information starts there because these reports are lacking a lot of key information. A lot of the byproducts we talked about before, like services, parts, and small ammunition or advanced antennas for interception of communication, which now is a key asset, or shutting down internet. That stuff will not even make the list. That's point number one. Point number two, when they do, information about it is so vague that you get a general definition about, I don't know, an assault rifle from France to Saudi Arabia. You have no idea of the type, of the model, or the make. So that's, again, information we have to fill ourselves. And it's information the state is failing to provide, and it's something they're supposed to be doing. And I think sort of getting back into the pipe of the business model, what I see very often, especially even when you ask directly for this kind of information, the reason you would hear why that information is not provided is to preserve the integrity and business confidentiality of the exporter. So again, this privilege that is reserved to this industry really really limits the possibility we have and the rights we have earned to have that information. So especially because of this failure, the work we can do on the ground is key. There are so many dynamics that are not exclusively connected to the arms trade, but like Catherine was underlying how the forced migration has opened another perspective into an issue that we thought was far away from our houses, and we wouldn't have to pay any consequences for this mass practice. I was thinking at the protest of harbor workers in France, Spain, and Italy, when it became known and documented that the Saudi ships that were about to dock were there full of weapons, getting more weapons and making their way to Yemen. That is something that has not been possible before. So naturally, we are lucky that we have access to certain platforms and sources we can consult ourselves. Some are for free, some are with very reasonable and limited prices. Again, hard to bring about a change that is so systematic and widespread in the entire European continent. But we have seen on a smaller example how powerful public opinion is in countries where, again, the government is wary of its electoral future. So we've seen in Germany, for example, or in Belgium, that politically wise coalitions had to stem or limit or block, in some case, the export to a certain country because people were pressuring the government to do so, and that became about only after they were told and they were informed in a very specific manner about where European countries were ending up. I guess I don't want to get into there, and we'll pass the word to Apo now, but I guess also the information dynamic has gone through a little bit of a crisis lately. So this more innovative and clearer visualized ways of passing this information to the public opinion, I think they really close the gap and they provide more concrete evidence of potentially the wrongdoings of governments and companies.
Thank you, Leone. I'll ask Apo to come in as well on the same question.
Happily so, but I will try to do it by actually picking up on Catherine's comment on how some of the progressive voices in the discussion ought to reconsider how they discuss security and how they engage with the concept of security, and trying to make it very simple. After the situation in Afghanistan, you noticed a lot of mouthpieces of the military industrial complex started shouting about the need to advance with defense union in Europe and to face reality and realize that we live in an assertive world with assertive superpowers. So meaning that the more actually resources have to go into militarization. And this happens, the voice is so loud because, this part of the discussants own the concept of security practically. They have every right to tell you that all these new people that now are coming towards the European Union very probably will turn into a security liability. Extremists might be hiding among them. True. I mean, you cannot deny it. But why can't you answer to this discussion that perhaps an equal or even greater security concern is a diversion of $85 billion weapons that the US left behind in the hands of the Taliban regime when they left from Afghanistan, which is the figure that Republican Congress people gave when discussing the situation in Afghanistan, for example. Or why can't you argue back that a security concern is also someone that is screwing and finalizing thermal batteries in a French little city, which then is exported to Turkey and enters a rocket, which is attached on a drone, which is deployed in Nagorno-Karabakh and bombs civilians that are displaced. Why isn't this a security concern? Which eventually comes back to undermine the security of the people that flee conflict, as well as potentially the people that are on the receiving end of the migratory pressures. So why we cannot expand the concept of security to include actually exports as a security concern itself in the end? And how do you do that? I think the only way to do that is by expanding the evidence base and the facts you can present in order to support this point of view. And by supporting with facts the discussion about causal links between the reality of the arms industry and the exports and the reality of what happens when these things are unleashed at the field. And I don't know why shouldn't we be very ambitious when it comes to how we think about incorporating the tools that appear now to be innovative and to be very strong in covering this evidence-based gap. Why don't we discuss about monitoring capacities that are supported by European budgets in order to produce this evidence? This could be an argument for the creation of monitoring capacity that addresses the lack of facts on the nexus of exports and displacement, but also answers very serious concerns about lack of monitoring on other issues. For example, allegations about violations of fundamental rights at the external borders of the EU. There's a huge discussion about monitoring mechanisms and the Commission proposals to create monitoring mechanisms for border to monitor border violence. There is environmental crimes that involve activities of organized crime. That's very difficult to exercise oversight over. And the tools are there, and they could be consolidated in something that potentially could look like an EU digital laboratory. You have EU paying massive amounts of money to support mass surveillance of population categories like refugees. Why don't they pay in order to establish a surveillance capacity to be able to expose what happens with diversion of weapons that cause displacement, or what happens with violence at the borders or environmental crimes conducted by illicit interests within the union? So I think we should be very ambitious there. We should actually come up with a proposal framed correctly and very targeted about the institutionalizing the capacity of OSINT into EU policy spheres, and this could look very much like other tools that the EU has decided to put in place that are underused, that have enormous value. For example, I'm thinking of the Conflict Armament Research Group, who is monitoring diversion in conflict zones and is supported by EU funds. And it could be used in a similar way. A tool that does OSINT investigations that fits in an authoritative and institutional manner these kind of issues, in order for the policymakers and the experts to be able to hold the discussions. Just to close it, there is another thing that is important. The report was conceived as a wake-up call to the migration and arms export experts to come together and discuss what can be done in the future. And I think we could close with this. I think there's a lot of possibilities creating a platform that these people can meet and exchange the knowledge that they have, and see how one can benefit the discourse of the other. And this is something we could request also from members of the parliament and people in the institutions to try to facilitate. In this venue, we can discuss about data, we can discuss about the tools, we can discuss and raise all these things that were raised today in a much more specific and scientific manner. I would like to thank you all for the, taking the time and for the opportunity to present the report, and hope to have another opportunity to continue the discussion.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Apo. I think we're out of time. It was a fantastic discussion. We tried to pack so much into an hour and a half, which was, yeah, maybe we were too ambitious. Although, Apo, you say we should be ambitious, so we tried. Yeah, before we finish, I think, well, to say thank you very much to Hannah, who, well, she left us earlier, but to thank her again. Thank you, Andrew, Catherine, Apo, and Leone. Thanks also to Jess and Josephine, who've been helping us out in the background. Thanks to those listening through Movement Radio. I hope you've enjoyed the discussion on the radio. I hope that everybody who has joined us will go and read the report if they haven't already. And inspired by Andrew's example from South Africa, I hope they will become involved in people movement, in pushing back against the power structures, a lot of the structures that we have discussed today. So thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you especially to our panelists. And we'll close now. We'll leave the chat open for another few minutes in case you want to exchange there. Okay, thank you everybody. Take care. Bye-bye.